Up next, we're going to be joined by Chelsea Bradbury from Global. She'll come into your screen in about a second. I'll try and contextualise for a minute. I've known Chelsea for a little while. There's Chelsea right now. Hello, Chelsea. How are you?
Hi, James. Good. How are you?
Yeah, really good. Thank you. Really good. Thanks for spending the morning of the hottest day for the last 200 years with us.
I wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
Well, there we go. Thank you. So, Chelsea, I'm sure you heard some of that discussion and were quite fascinated. I think one of the things you work at DAX, which is for those that aren't initiated, if you like, what was the pod or digital audio bit of Global Radio, and your specialism is the podcast side. You work with podcast talent, both up and coming and kind of established, some global radio talent coming into the podcast world. And I suppose that one of the key reasons why we wanted to talk to you was audio is a hot space right now. Lots of people are talking about podcasts. What I'd love to know is, let's start with this. What trends have we seen happening in audio, and what trends do you think are here to stay?
Yeah, I think DAX is a really, it's not nice to kind of take a good thing out of a bad situation sometimes, but in terms of digital audio itself, coronavirus and what's been happening in the last few months is really just accelerated DAX as a platform. So DAX as a platform is all digital audio through any connected device. And we've seen the latest Midas report was in May, and we now see that 403 million hours per week are spent listening to digital audio. So the sheer volume of that and how that's broken down across DAX is Global's radio streams and third-party streams alongside different music on demand, so people like SoundCloud, and then obviously, if you've mentioned podcasting. So audio listening just purely for DAX during coronavirus, so from March onward, we've seen an uplift of 31%, which is huge over quite a small period of time. Podcasts, they've reached 10 million people a week. That's record breaking for podcasts, and for DAX specifically, we've seen listens up 14%. We're seeing more women listen. We're seeing the age group of 55 plus listen. SoundCloud, during the corona, they had an additional 30,000 songs added. And just from our radio stations and our streaming, there's been 15% growth. Sorry, I'm like killing you with stats here.
That's fine, don't worry, I'm taking notes.
15% growth across our stations, and then things like LBC, obviously, news content has just been, so highly consumed. I think in terms of what's here to stay, I think that how we are really moving into a world of working from home, spending more time with family. I just think the growth of smart speakers, listening through connected devices, definitely the consumption of podcasting is just going to keep growing. And the amount of content that's actually been created off the back of coronavirus has been huge.
Anecdotally, I mean, I'm a Six Music listener. They changed their schedule. Interestingly, actually, Radio 1 are changing their schedule on September the 1st, and it's going to more reflect their lockdown schedule than the previous schedule, if you like. So just kind of an example. I know, if you like talking about global talent, Ian Dale stopped doing some of the podcasts he does. He wasn't doing his book club, for example, but he carried on doing his politics podcast. Just thinking very kind of personally, at the start of lockdown, I wanted to consume as much news content as I possibly could. Yeah. By the end, I was bored rigid and I wanted more escapist stuff. Yeah. What trends are you seeing in terms of environmentally that, if you like, throughout lockdown, and what trends do you think are going to stay in terms of the sort of stuff people are seeking out?
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting. As you can imagine, news content just absolutely spiked at the beginning. So we monetize people like Sky News, right. Telegraph. Obviously, we've got our own LBC platform. So in terms of those podcastings, the listening just went through the roof, and actually a lot of content was created specific. So coronavirus, the latest from the Telegraph, was actually a daily update produced by them, which saw just thousands and thousands of listens. We then, and obviously we saw a big drop off in sport at the beginning. It then kind of shifted, and like you've said, James, I think people got sick of hearing about it.
Mm.
I used to call it Boris o'clock at 4 o'clock every day when he used to come on, and I think I got to a stage where I was like, I'm going to go insane if I keep listening. And what we actually saw is a real boom in comedy.
Right.
So we monetize lockdown parenting hell. So I don't know if there's any parents on the call, but even if you're not a parent, it's actually very funny. But
Mm.
it kind of became quite clear that people were just looking for escapism, and actually podcasting was kind of taken away from your commuting and then just became kind of like this 45 minutes to an hour in a day that you could maybe just be away from either your laptop or your family, let's be honest.
Yeah.
And then we also have seen, like, from the comedy bit, the next kind of surge that we saw was just health and well-being. So, you know, mental health podcasts, people reaching out. And the way that the radio has kind of impacted that and filtered through as well is that the radio became like a safe space for people. You know, people used to be calling in and having conversations with people because everybody was going through it. Like, I know Roman Kemp, who does Capital, he was like, all of a sudden we don't have this big bright stars coming into the studio, we're literally seeing into their homes and we're FaceTiming, and everybody's going through the same thing. So I think any audio content, and especially podcasting, is just become an escapism for people, really. And it's just interesting. I mean, we're seeing sport spike back up, but one interesting thing about sport is all of a sudden you had access to all this talent that was at home and not playing sport. So a lot of content has been created and shifted away from just reviews of live games to actually, you know, talking about, you know, past history and greatest games and things like that.
It's a really good point. The access to talent thing is incredible. I think what's amazing is just how, as a society, we've got used to podcast interviews being done on Zoom or on Clean Feed, whatever your technology of choice. It's amazing how, as listeners, it's like, oh, okay, this is part of the new normal now. And people are understanding. And your point about access to talent is such a good one. I mean, again, anecdotally, we run a youth content and youth marketing, youth culture podcast called Rocket Fuel. And we wrote to World Wrestling Entertainment about 6 months ago, expecting we'd get someone in marketing. And they gave us the world champion, you know, 6 million subscribers onto his Instagram feed. It's just incredible who they'd give. And your sport one about reflecting as opposed to analysing. I mean, the stat that somebody told me is something like, I'm a Tottenham fan, don't judge me for it. And the Spurs podcasts all see a huge spike in listening when Spurs lose, because everybody is joined by that negative experience. The same reason you don't speak to your commuter buddy until you can roll your eyes because the train's delayed. You need that kind of bond over, oh, here we go again. It's funny that it can be a shared experience, even though it's an isolated experience. I want to touch on brands and the way that brands can get involved in podcasts, because I think we all know how pre-roll works. I think we all understand how in-reads work. I'd love to know almost examples of when it works well and when it works less well, but also what's the scope for brands to get involved in creating their own podcasts? Are there any good examples?
Yeah, I think it's a really fine line, and podcasting's changing all the time. Like, even in, you know, the last year, I've seen it grow and develop. And just to put it into perspective with another stat, I mean, our host read April to June year on year is up 36%, and that isn't just due to you know, people spending more money. It's about education of advertisers actually wanting to come into the podcast market and them seeing the benefit of how intimate the listening is with a user and how engaging it is. What you don't want to do with a podcast is make it just so brand oriented that it scares the listener away. So we have tried that before. You know, we've done different, we did a partnership with Waitrose, partnered with Classic FM and did kind of like the best kind of tunes for the kind of kitchen cooking and things like that. And it worked well, and we saw good spikes of listens. But what something like that doesn't always have is longevity. And with podcasting, what you need is the commitment from both. And I think brands actually, as long as you have that content and your brand fits with it well, actually that you can do things like very organic messaging within the content actually is probably more powerful than, you know, having your logo stuck everywhere and things like that. So one thing that works really well within kind of a trusted podcast series is a branded episode. So Outspoken Beauty, she's done a branded episode before for Dermalogica, and she had somebody from Dermalogica, she interviewed them, and basically it was just a really natural way of talking around all the different Dermalogica products, and it was all about beauty, so it wasn't just centered on that, but you know, they just fit in a really nice way. So I think it's just, I'm very cautious because content is so important with podcasting. And so you just have to be really careful with like the messaging. But the beauty is when it's the host read and it sits within the content, and or it's a sponsorship, it can just work like really, really like organically, which I've already said.
Yeah, and Chelsea, it seems to me, I mean, look, I've spent time working in commercial radio brainstorms, and particularly with global, and particularly with capital and heart, there was always a very clear delineation between church and state. There was always a very, Jamie Theakston would not do a promotion like that. That is not how we do competitions on capital. It seems to me that there is more flexibility in the podcasting space. Is that a fair assumption to say? Yeah,
because it's totally down to you're not representing a brand, you're really representing yourself. So you know, with I'll get a live example of that is Chris Moyles obviously has his own podcast. I think it was Heineken did a partnership with Radio X, but it didn't mean that Chris couldn't then talk about other alcohol brands or beer brands or whatever on his podcast, because it's a totally different platform. And I think that's why, you know, you're not representing Radio X, he's representing, you know, well, that's probably not a great example because it is around his show, but like it's very much about the talent. And obviously I think that the more that we're seeing kind of traction in the sponsorship and host read, you know, people are, you know, they do turn away a lot of brands. It's kind of podcasting's kind of the audio extension of socials.
Yeah.
So it has to be, you know, really tied up with what they want to do. And because also the messaging just won't sound genuine, which is what you want, really.
Are there gaps in the podcast space, Chelsea? I mean, what are you looking for next? I mean, is certainly, I guess, going back to the first renaissance of podcasting, it felt like a male preserve. It was sporty, it was geeky. Yeah. But now, I mean, even across the DAX roster, there are female talent like Amelia Liana. So are there gaps? What have we seen changed, and what's the future?
I think it's become a lot more strategic. So I think originally, if you look at something like My Dad Wrote a Porno, I don't think they ever realised like how big that would have boomed. It was kind of a funny idea, 3 friends, and it's absolutely blown up. I don't think people are creating podcasts. I mean, people are, but commercially, we're not really looking for just off the cuff. You know, it has to be a really good marriage of the talent, the commitment to the podcast. I mean, it does take a while to scale. Like, there's only about under 20% of the UK actually listening to podcasts. So it's like having an Instagram account when nobody has Instagram yet. So you've got to have the commitment there. I think what's interesting about the gaps question is it's almost like Netflix for audio. Like, you don't know you're going to love something like Tiger King until it's put in front of you and everyone's talking about it. So I think there's gaps in the sense that we probably don't know what we're missing until it comes, which is probably really like...
no, it's not. I mean, it's funny, isn't it, that if you like, all Netflix has offered, as well as a load of money to make a load of new content. But actually, I don't think what podcast suffers from is a lack of content, but it hugely suffers from a lack of discoverability. Yeah. And if anybody can crack that, that's half the thing why a brand wouldn't launch a branded podcast, because you'd have to spend so much money getting cut through in the first place, or showing that commitment, to your point.
And everything's sat in its own like walled garden. So, you know, like, it's weird because the people that you compete with for content and monetization are actually your friends in the market as well. So I'm constantly speaking to people like Spotify and Apple, because a podcast can sits on all of those platforms, and you're monetizing on all of those platforms. And the greater good is that you just want to drive as many downloads as possible across all of those different third parties. So yeah, it's definitely a very interesting space.
We've had a question, and it's kind of a 2-part question. The question has come from, they haven't given a name, sadly, but it's a good one. So whoever it is, take the credit. But they've sort of made the point of, how important is the data of the audience in this? And also, what are the metrics of success when a brand wants to get involved in a podcast campaign? I suppose, is it a direct return on investment? Should the metrics be softer about brand appraisal, Chelsea? What are your thoughts?
So the biggest metric is always going to be downloads. I mean, the data that you can get from it, like I just mentioned with all the walled gardens, it's really difficult because, not to get too technical, but all of your data will only sit within your walled platform. So I will always say to people, like, get yourself an Apple account, claim your RSS feed, get yourself a Spotify account, because still like 70 to 80% of people are listening on Apple. Therefore, you've got the biggest view of your demographics. So you would get demographics from a hosting platform, but it's not a big enough view to really get a picture of it. There's loads of work being done on that. I think the main metric for any brands wanting to get involved at the moment is impressions. So that is basically your download numbers times by the ad markers. You will never fill 100% of a podcast inventory, because when people stream, they might, drop off halfway because they've got to their friend's house or whatever, and therefore you lose the opportunity to serve all of the ads. So typically it's a CPM model, and kind of impressions and reach based on downloads is your biggest metric. It is definitely becoming more important. We're getting asked a lot more about audience information. A lot of the time we will use talent and obviously take their social information, which gives us a guide. But also we've seen sponsors coming into the market lately for new content. So we're about to launch a Mark Wright podcast in September, and we've already got a sponsor on board for him, just based on estimating how well it's going to do.
Great. Okay, that's interesting. Another question that's just come in, actually: how do we find out where our audience might be and what podcasts they might be listening to? And how can we find out where the audience is in this question. So is there a Bible anywhere where we can find a podcast, a series of podcasts to get a male 18 to 24 audience? Or is it something whereby we have to get in touch with agencies like us, people like you? Do you see what I mean?
So with DAX, like including all the radio streaming and the music streaming alongside podcasts, obviously we have we use Nielsen. We've got loads of different third-party data overlay. We can do like data matches. So if you wanted to target different audience or a different vertical, we can very much do that with DAX, and it can also podcasts sit within that.
Cool.
It's just kind of constant learning with podcasting. So there isn't like a Bible to say, because it's just growing all the time and it depends on where you get access to that audience. But it's like the build of that data. I'm not really answering this properly, but you can basically, as long as you've got your demographic, we can make very good assumptions based on the podcast content that we've got.
Okay. Chelsea, final question for me, and then I will let you get back to the hottest day of the year, maybe the last 200 years. And it's one around future gazing, and that is, what do you think we're going to see next? You might give us an answer around the sort of content. You might give us an answer in terms of how brands integrate. You might give us an answer in terms of a new genre of podcast. Where are we going next with digital audio?
Oh, that's a loaded question, James. I think, do you know what? I actually had a conversation about this with somebody yesterday, and they were saying, like, if anybody could predict the next 6 months, you'd probably be able to make a lot of money, because I think it's changed so much. All I can say is, like, the one word that comes to my mind is just growth. Like, I think the growth that's out there, the amount of talent, like I mentioned earlier, that we've had access to, the big names that are actually getting into it. I just think podcasting is definitely just the place to be, in terms of where advertisers and brands should be.
Yeah.
But that, again, it doesn't really answer your question properly, but it's just all about growth for me.
No, that makes perfect sense. Chelsea, I really appreciate you spending this time with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, James.
No worries. See you very soon. Nice one. So that was Chelsea from Global.